Good. Well, the warmest of welcomes this evening to all of you for what promises to be a fascinating and memorable interchange between Anne McElvoy and the star of the occasion, Hella Pick. As some of you will know, my name's Monica Bohm-Duchin. I'm the initiator and then the director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which existed as a year-long nationwide festival from March 2019 to March 2020, then rudely curtailed, but thank God not earlier, by COVID. And I was prompted by the lockdown to go online, basically, not something I had ever dreamt of before, but it's proved a wonderfully effective way of continuing, sort of that, or ensuring that the festival has a tremendously rich afterlife in terms of online events, and I hope to continue with them into the rest of this year. But let's concentrate on the matter at hand. As those of you who do know the project will know, the primary impetus of the festival was to pay tribute to people like Hella, who came to this country as refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe and contributed so richly and in such diverse and pervasive ways to this country's cultural and every other sort of life, every other aspect of society. So it's my great pleasure to have you here today, Hella. I'll just say a few words about her interlocutor, Anne McElvoy, who I'm sure is also a name well known to many of you. She's the senior editor of the Economist and columnist at the Evening Standard, as well as a well-known Radio 4 presenter. She's covered UK and European politics for the last 20 years or so. And before that was a foreign correspondent covering the fall of the Berlin Wall, the war in Yugoslavia, and was also bureau chief in Moscow for the Times. And I understand that you've known each other for a long time. It goes back to the days of the GDR, I believe. So it's my great pleasure then to hand over to Anne to compare the event. I will just say few practical details. You all know the ropes, I think, by heart by now, but just to ensure that you all stay mute for the moment. You might also want to turn your video cameras off. I think that generally works better in terms of the broadband width and all that sort of stuff. It will be recorded. I'll say more about that later. And also, if you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to do so by typing into the chat, and then I will field them at the end of the session. So over to you, Anne, and you tell me when you want me to start screen sharing.
Thank you very much indeed. As you can tell, Monica basically seems to be capable of doing everything all at once. She initiates, she oversees, she is the tech, she's the presiding genius without whom none of us would be here tonight.
Don't speak too soon, but yes.
Don't exactly. One should never tempt fate, but we have every faith in you. Before we get underway, I just want to say a few personal words about my guest tonight, Hella Pick. You will know her as the author of an extraordinary new book, Invisible Wars, which she's written in her youth, but we have great hopes for the next years for Hella as a writer. We know that Hella never stopped. She's never stopped since I first met her. We had a brief debate before we came on air about when we first met. I remember meeting Hella looking very, very soigné in a gorgeous jacket, which I kind of didn't get the impression was CNA. And conversing fluently in German and English and receiving compliments all around her at a very, as I say, rather sort of upmarket, upscale kind of do in the Chancellor's office in Germany or something. She rather more pragmatically says, no, we kind of met when we were doing proper work on the ground in the old East Germany. And as always, when it comes to matters of memory, I can say to you, always defer to Hella Pick. And she's used that memory and that grasp of detail and an extraordinary backpack of journalist and life skills gathered over so many decades in this new book. And Monica, we might just have a look at the cover because I think that will get us going. And it also has that lovely sense of looking back on a lot of an extraordinary era, really, and an extraordinary life as it's just hidden itself on my screen. There it is. A journalist in search of her life. Invisible Wars, I think, is a very clever title, Hella Pick. I wouldn't have expected you to be in search of your life. So why did you choose that as a subtitle?
Well, I think it developed as I was writing the book, because the theme that runs through the book is that somehow the fact of having been a refugee, even though, of course, I came to Britain as a very young child and really have lived most of my life in this country, still I have been uprooted. And I think the fact of having been uprooted leaves a certain degree of insecurity in every refugee. This is a subject that refugees talk about amongst themselves very often. And it is quite clear that however much you integrate in the society where you grow up, where you work, where I've made my professional career, lived most of my life, and yet there is always that insecurity that runs like a thread through my life. And that, in a way, is why I say I have lived my life in search of my life, always still trying to establish that security that I wanted and never quite secured. So I think that, I hope, is a partial explanation to the title.
There are three images here that we can see. We see you as a small girl and then a very confident young woman. And we're now going back to your childhood. And I'm very pleased that we're going to do that in this, apart from your near-miss career as an Olympic swimmer, which it's got a lovely sort of silvery gelatine kind of pattern at this image. I think it's very beautiful. You also have some wonderful images and posters and photographs in your home. Tell us a little bit about this period, if you don't mind just divulging roughly when we are, and a little bit about your early childhood, because it does, as you say, it explains a lot about the way that you then go about writing your story.
Well, this picture actually tells something about my determination. This is in a swimming pool in Vienna, and I've been found at the bottom of that pool. And by sheer good chance, it was discovered before I'd actually expired. I decided I was 4 years old and I was going to swim. So I got into the water apparently and sunk very nicely to the bottom of the pool. So it was then decided I'd better learn how to swim. And this was actually my swimming teacher. And I must say, I had a very handsome one.
That wasn't bad at all. I thought. Good choice.
But you can see, I mean, that sort of sense of determination had started early in my life. Well, I mean, apart from learning how to swim, I came from a very conventional, middle-class, Jewish, non-religious, on my mother's side, not at all religious, but still a middle-class Jewish family, fully integrated into Austrian society at that period. But my father came from a very Orthodox family, and my parents divorced when I was only 3 years old. And the way my mother always told it to me was that the reason why the marriage broke up is because she could not deal with the Orthodox side of his family, even though he himself was a completely secular Jew. So I grew up basically during this period in Vienna, living partly with my mother and partly with my grandparents, because my mother was often away in France. And I went to a state school. Here's my mother. She was a very good-looking woman, I have to say. But and that was, I don't know when that was taken, but it was obviously, I think, when it must have been in her late 20s or early 30s, and but still in Austria. And she was born in 1900, and so she left Austria in 39, so she spent almost the first 40 years of her life in Austria. And she doted on me as her only child. And nevertheless, sorry, should I go on now?
Please do. Please do. I'd love to hear a bit more about your childhood, and then we'll find out about what happens at the Anschluss.
I went to school, and I found, when I was working on this book, I found a lovely birthday book that I had where my fellow students, pupils at the school on my birthdays always did little drawings and wrote short verses about me. And I've quoted some of that in the book, and it really is charming how, you know, they swore eternal love and friendship and everything else. But I also found in that book a message from one of the teachers with a sort of warning. This was obviously in 1938, after the Nazis had taken over in Vienna, that life was going to change. And obviously that book stopped in 1939. At the end of 1938, I think that was the last entry that I found in that book. And then at that point, my mother was under huge pressure because she had, I mean, I have very little memories, sadly, of all those years, and I've tried to piece it together as best I can, and it's not that perfect. But I do remember that we had lived in the outskirts of Vienna, but after 1938, my mother moved into the center of Vienna, and we shared a flat with someone that she didn't know that well, but who had a very large flat and was able to take care of us. And twice the Gestapo came, fetched my mother, took her away, and by some magic she returned. But of course, after that had happened, her own insecurity, what would happen to her and what would happen to me, obviously decided her that she had to put me on a Kindertransport. And she succeeded in doing that. And off I went early in 1939 and arrived in Liverpool Street, London. So,
do you remember the journey? Do you remember anything of the arrival or that experience?
I remember very little, but I do remember arriving in Liverpool Street and arriving in a great big hall, and where the families who were going to take care of the children were waiting to be presented with their new charges. And I sort of have this vague memory of meeting my foster parents and saying goodbye, because that was about the only English word that I knew. But what I did find was that after just one day or maybe 2 days of arriving in London, I sent a postcard to my mother in which I just very roughly described that, obviously, that I'd arrived. And the thing that I remembered most about it was that on the boat from to Harwich, we had one more, as I put it, physical examination, but I was lucky I didn't have to undress, I said. Now, I'm referring to that because it's actually something that I've only learned to understand much more recently, about the time when I started writing this book, because I was invited to, here in London, to a conference on Kindertransport. And what I understood for the first time was how very selective the Kindertransport scheme was. It was a committee here in London that had persuaded Neville Chamberlain to commit himself to the Kindertransport, which of course was a huge achievement. But the idea had been to give children only temporary visas. Britain didn't want to have permanent charge of these women. Somehow still the idea that this was somehow going to be temporary. But the committee, the pressure group that was trying to facilitate the Kindertransport, really envisaged that these children would be destined eventually for Palestine and for the concept of an Israeli homeland, so that they were in effect sort of working material for a future state. But in addition to that, particularly the British authorities wanted children that would not sort of stand out and would physically conform as much as possible to the British population, to the average population. Anyway, the end result was that the children that were selected came mostly from middle-class families, were well educated, and also what the British end was absolutely vital is that the children were totally healthy. And this goes back to my still being examined on the boat, because there were examples where children were actually refused entry because they were not well. But the bad side of all of this is that in Vienna there were thousands of destitute, orphaned Jewish children from
who simply couldn't, would not have been eligible.
Who didn't make it.
Well, it's an extraordinarily important insight, actually, to that incredible nuanced story of the Kindertransport. Can you just flick us, Monica, to the next image? Because I think that does. We've lost one of you somewhere along the way. So when you were first here, the image that I have from the book in my mind, I think you're in the Lake District. You're on a holiday, or you're with a group of people. You're still growing up, and I wondered, how was that? I mean, we talk a lot about the children and the children's view of Kindertransport. We give less attention. I mean, now I think we're in a time where we think a lot about young people and about adolescence and teenage years. That must have been very, very difficult. By this stage, you look absolutely in command of your future on your graduation day, but there must have been very difficult years in between of getting accustomed to a new family. You can tell us a bit about them, but also this a completely new world, and of course being uprooted from your background.
I think I was amongst the very lucky ones, because first of all, my mother was able to leave, and we were reunited. So I never had that complete rupture from family. At least I had my mother here, and of course, refugee women on their own, the only way they could survive, the only work they were allowed to do was domestic work. And my mother, in effect, became a cook. And I was the cook's daughter. And we were in the Lake District, and there's quite a lot of story attached to how we got to the Lake District. And I went to a private school there and so on. So I had this split life between going to a school with, it was a boarding school that had a certain number of few day pupils. They all came from reasonably well-to-do families and so on. And there was I every day cycling to the school from a house in which we lived very much segregated from the owners, and my mother was treated as a servant, as the cook. And I hardly ever spoke to they never spoke to me. They had absolutely no interest in the owners, our employers. It was right on Lake Windermere. I had permission to go and swim in the lake, but I had to respect the fact that I could only cross the garden to go down to the lake if the owners were not in the garden. So it was a curious existence.
It's a bit contingent, yes.
But,
yes.
And of course, at school, I was trying to hide all of this and only had 2 or 3 of the day pupils who became my very close friends, and they were allowed to know how I lived and could visit me. but it was not an easy situation. But I was happy at school, and I was doing well at school, so that it had its positive sides. And of course, being in the Lake District, it was an extraordinary sheltered life, because you hardly knew, you had very little contact with, I mean, we were not bombed, it was peaceful. And so again, it was in many ways a lucky teenage period.
And what took you to economics? You went to London School of Economics. That was also quite a daring leap, quite a confident thing to do, because it's not as if you'd gone to London and mingled in circles where, particularly for young women at the time, that was very common. What was that like?
Well, first of all, I was too young. I was only 17 when I got my LSE. And it was, I will never understand it, because at the time, the LSE actually had a bar not to take in women under 18. And at first, I mean, I went for an interview, was accepted, but was told I would have to wait a year. And of course, this was not a period for gap years. That the concept of the gap year was not yet prevalent. And I was devastated. What was I going to do for a year? We had no money. Anyway, it's within, I think, a month, they changed their minds and offered me a place after all. And it was largely due to the fact that I had an introduction to Harold Lasky, who was at that time the preeminent professor of political science at LSE. And he, for some mysterious reason, decided that I was good student material, and may have done something to make it possible for me to be accepted. But above all, which is extraordinary, he offered to pay my fees for the first 2 years at LSE. And I found a letter in which he said, this is a private matter, and I do not wish it to be known officially in the school. And of course, I studied political science. I mean, economics. I had to do economics, but my main subject was political science.
And shortly after the LSE, it seems to me that you found your feet pretty quickly in wanting to be a journalist. But what was the route? I'm always fascinated by what is it, this vector that takes a bright young person, and you already had, although you probably hadn't intended it the way that it happened, but an international background. What made you think it's going to be the typewriter for me? It's going to be journalism.
Not at all. I did not emerge from LSE thinking I wanted to be a journalist. What I wanted to do was to work for an international organization. I tried every way I could to get into the UN and whatever international. I was turned down at the UN, probably for other reasons too, but above all because I still, of my Austrian origin, because the UN was operating a quota system, and even though I acquired British nationality in 1947, my origin counted, and I couldn't get in. And I tried. Then I got, by chance, a job doing market research in what was then known as the Colonial Development Corporation. That was the famous ground-up scheme.
Oh yes,
scheme.
I've forgotten about that.
But I learned, but I was dealing with the economies of West Africa in that institution. And I knew that I was not made for a 9-to-5 job. I still didn't know that I thought I wanted to be a journalist. However, I just started looking for other jobs. And one day I answered an advertisement in the Statesman for commercial editor of a magazine called West Africa, of which I'd never heard. And lo and behold, I was taken on, and that's how I got into journalism. I'd never, until then, it had not been a sort of mission to become a journalist. But once I was there, of course, I realized that that's what I wanted to do.
There you are. This looks like this image of you with the then president of Guinea.
Yes.
Yes. Tell us about that. Is that your first big outing? As you say, you're kind of dressed to kill for that interview, aren't you? You know, you've got that very serious Hella Pick.
Well,
look, what's going on there? Because what's the story behind the picture?
Well, the story simply was that I was doing quite a lot of work at Bush House, BBC's World Service, and Secretary, who was the most rebellious of the French African leaders who wanted full independence for his country, Guinea, right from the beginning, while most of the other leaders of French West Africa were content with a sort of the Gaullist Commonwealth concept, which would have left a great deal of power still in French hands. And he was the one leader who said no to all of that, and who was totally cast off by de Gaulle, with the country left to fend for itself without any further assistance from the French authorities. And he, at this point, was on a visit to Britain, on an official visit, and I was doing an interview with the BBC with him. But by that time, I had spent quite a lot of time in both what was then still British and French West Africa. This was an extraordinary period of the late 50s, when all those countries were negotiating their independence. And of course, the British colonies all acquired full independence, and the French, for quite a long time, sort of hovered in a sort of no man's land with a large degree of close integration with France, except for Guinea. But for me, this was a strange introduction to journalism, because there were very few Western journalists covering those negotiations and visiting those countries and writing about what their hopes and aspirations and aims were.
Let's have a look at you somewhere else in the world. If we just move along, Monica, thank you, to the next slide. This is extremely elegant. I now know why you went into the business you went into. You like the clothes. But to explain what's going on here, because obviously we've moved around the globe a bit. It says here in your caption, beautification in a sari. Beautification. Explain.
Well, I'm looking I decided that wearing saris beautifies. I think saris are a wonderful way of wearing clothes. And,
you wear it well.
Well, I don't know how long it would have stayed in that shape after I started walking.
Either. That's what I've given them a wide berth for that reason.
Best not to test.
Absolutely gorgeous. It's a gorgeous picture.
But no, well.
But what took you there? What's the background to the picture?
Well, the background to that was that I was in love with the owner of that. Well, not the owner. I was in love with an Indian diplomat. Who also happened to be a Maharaja, but of the smallest Indian state, and this was his home. And I was on a visit, and I remember his sisters decided that they wanted to dress me up in the sari, and I was obviously very happy.
That's the first. Sorry, go on.
Pardon?
Do go on now. Finish your sentence. I was just going to come in.
All I was going to say is that, to my own surprise, I decided that this book would not be complete if I didn't write something substantial about my personal relationships.
Well, that's very.
And this.
I was going to say that's an interesting point, because it sounds like it was the first time that you really let some light in on your personal life, and combining that as a young female correspondent at a time when it was difficult on all schools, difficult to have relationships if you weren't going to settle down, or didn't think that your ultimate aim was to settle down and marry, or maybe stop traveling. But also difficult because we're about to come on, and perhaps we might just flick along in this context to, we're very much dealing, so we've moved quite a long way in time, but we won't worry about that. The geezer, Mr. Ceausescu. It's just that you spent a lot of your time in what was thought of as a man's world. How did you manage that relationship between giving your private life, having some fun, and at the same time, you're making your way up in the world, and you've been, by the stage, you become a UN expert at The Guardian. You're doing a job that was previously regarded as being for men.
Well, of course, I made a lot of friends on the road, and long-lasting friendships, which is fortunate. But of course, you also lose a lot. And I think, what I've sort of not got into great detail with, but even so, I decided there are 2 chapters in this book in which I describe 2 very close relationships. And I think, a lot of it has to do with the kind of life that I was living, and the difficulties of sustaining relationships when you're traveling a lot. But I think, again, this is where I come back to not just a journalist in search of her life, but probably a woman in search of her life. It is this search for reassurance and security, which punctuated both my working life and my private life.
Did you ever think of giving up your journalistic career and your globe trotting for your private life, or was that never really a consideration?
Well, I'm perfectly certain I would have done it, but not on my own. I mean, I couldn't have done it without a partner.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to have a family. And, I think there's something self-destructive in all of this, but I'm not going to start going into analysis at this point.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, for a start, there are just trade-offs in this kind of life for foreign correspondents.
And you're an example of managing to have both a family and a very busy professional life.
Yes. I'm not sure one's family always see that as an unadulterated blessing, but that's one for all of us with a big gin and tonic afterwards, Hella, on another occasion. Monica, could you do me a favor? Could you find me an image from, we've got Ceausescu there because we've got to hear about that, but I really want to have something about The Guardian and about that time really when anything that reflects the UN or the Guardian years. And then, in fact, we're among friends. We can just find an image when Monica is able, if she can. But we haven't really understood what took you to The Guardian. You were obviously very talented, and here we go. I think it's the next one along. There, but
you did mention this one. I don't know whether you want to stop.
Yes, I do. If you just find one that there's a look back page, the front page, but it just gives us a sense. There we go. Thank you. It's always where it's like socks, isn't it? It's where you didn't think you put it. This is obviously a look back. HP sweeps the board, and one of those lovely pages that are put together, as Hella points out.
If you could actually read the text, you would see. I mean,
it's probably got loads of really. If I know leaving pages at The Guardian, it's full of really rude jokes, and I sheltered audience.
It was a moment of truth. This is the kind of thing that The Guardian used to do for departing journalists. They just do a front page and make fun of you all the way through.
Oh God, absolutely. We've all got them. And of course, they're far too true, aren't they, Hella? That is so true. The reason I pull it up, I mean, that's obviously a joke, and it's The Guardian as it you see the modern Guardian. But tell me, do you remember the year that you went to the Guardian and what that meant to you, and also where you fitted in there? Because to give the role of covering the UN, you were still a reasonably unseasoned journalist. They obviously had a huge belief in you. What took you there?
Luck. Look, the first lucky connection with the Guardian was that when I was still working for that magazine, West Africa, by chance, the Guardian had seconded its foreign editor to spend a year editing a paper called the Nigerian Daily, at that time called the Nigerian Daily Times, which was actually a Daily Mirror owned publication, like the West Africa was. And I met said foreign editor Geoffrey Taylor in West Africa, in Nigeria, and he asked me to write a couple of features for the Guardian. That was the beginning of my connection with the Guardian, and I may have written, I don't know, maximum half a dozen pieces for the Guardian at that point. Then I was sacked from West Africa by Cecil King, the chairman of the Mirror, without any explanation. And I started freelancing. I started doing a lot of broadcasting for the BBC. And it was the opening of I don't know if people still remember something called the non-aligned movement, which was a grouping of countries that wanted to maintain their distance from the great powers and were working for nuclear disarmament. And so anyways, long story. They were having their opening summit in Belgrade, and I wrote to the Guardian editor and said, Alistair Hetherington, and asked if I could help cover that conference because I knew some of the African leaders who would be at that meeting. And it was agreed that I could go and help the then diplomatic editor of the Guardian, who was Richard Scott, who was still a member, he's one of the surviving members of the Scott family that owned the Guardian, so he was a man of considerable standing in the Guardian. Anyway, we got on very well together. I got some good stuff for the paper, made my first front page lead on the Guardian, which I was extremely proud. I still have a copy of that. And, anyway, the long and short of it was that he went back to the Guardian and suggested that I should go to the UN and cover that autumn's 1961 UN General Assembly session. And being Richard Scott, he persuaded the editor to do that. And I was sent off to New York just on a freelance basis to cover that session. And at the end of it, I said, could I now please be on the staff? And Alistair Hetherington said, no, because if I give you a job now, I take you on for life, because in those days, people still made a full-time career on one newspaper. And he said he wasn't ready for that. But he sent me back to West Africa to come to do some features. And while I was there, I got a message and said, come back and we'll take you on. And with that, he sent me off to New York as UN correspondent. So, I was still not part of the Guardian because I was still on my own in New York. I hadn't got to know the organization or the people, except the foreign editor and the editor. And those were my only real sort of contacts with the Guardian at that time. And it took a while before I actually got to know the Guardian itself, which came later.
I think it was once said that there were only two great jobs in journalism. One was editor and the other was editor's friend. So I think you missed out a lot of that, all the hassle of getting to know them wide.
You're absolutely right. I really got most favored treatment from Alistair Hetherington. But, of course, at that time, the great Alistair Cook was the Guardian's bureau chief in America. And I worked very close, and he became a very close friend, but he really became my mentor. But one of the things he said to me, you will always find that the editor who gives you your first job on a news organization will be the one who will be the special one. And the subsequent editors, important though they were, never had the same.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. We always remember that with particular fondness. And tell us a little bit, I mean, just as our time is moving on, so I'm going to be a bit selective and say, in that time at the UN, I think what you did so brilliantly, both there, but also you were up and down, you moved on to work in Washington. You had that great eye for knowing who to find and who to kind of make into, I don't think journalists ever really, in a sense, have friends. They can have friendly contacts, but you were very, very good, I think, at just finding your way, whether it was to Henry Kissinger or to Kennedy. I'm going to come to Germany in just a minute when you come back to Europe, but tell me who really impressed you in that period. You met pretty much everyone one would want to meet in that period. As I say, it would be Kennedy, Kissinger, still around on foreign affairs to this day. Tell us about one or two of those encounters.
Well, in those days, I'm trying to think who would particularly stand out, but I think during that first period in New York, I was really on a steep learning curve, and I can't really sort of, I was meeting a lot of diplomats. I would say I'm really getting Alzheimer's in names. I mean, a lot of people whose names.
But if I said to you, for instance, what impression did the young or younger Henry Kissinger make on you? What would you say to that?
Well, that came a little bit later. I mean, yes. I mean, once I'd got acclimatized with it, and of course, once I started going a lot to Washington as well as to New York. Then, yes, I got to know the Kissingers. I got to know Pierre Salinger, who was Kennedy's spokesman, became a very close friend, and of course, the diplomats from the various countries, the ambassadors, and so on. And one started making friends, but started picking out people at this point. I mean, there were so many, and there are a lot of the names now we do forget anymore. But I really kind of, I'm stuck in the idea of actually naming.
What about, I mean, Kennedy is just someone so iconic for that era, JFK, that any thoughts that you have about that? I mean, just having been able to cover that period, what did you take away about the Kennedy, either the man himself or about the mythology that's been built around Camelot and JFK?
Look, Kennedy, to me, will always remain a hugely important figure in his vision, but also a very flawed figure because he made mistakes. I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, at that time I was in New York, and like many other people at that time, we all wondered whether we were going to be alive the next day. And I still remember the speeches, the exposure, the exchanges between the Americans and the Russians, of course, when they showed the proof that the Soviet missiles were on their way. And those were dramatic times. And of course, I remember that, but I remember all the debates about apartheid in Rhodesia and South Africa. It was a steep learning curve in international relations, the early period of the UN. And then when I started covering American affairs, of course, I became intimately intrigued and involved in American politics and covered presidential campaigns, Goldwater campaign, Nixon campaign, and so on. So, there was so many people, so many figures, so many interesting people that I was meeting all the time. And of course, from that period, friends emerged, including at least one who's watching this screen at the moment.
Ah, that's a good
At least
cue.
if she's still there.
Maybe we will hear from the mystery friend later. Actually, you gave me a very good cue, Hella, to say we'll chat if it's okay, because we'd like to get you back over to Europe and talk a little bit about that period and the Cold War period in Europe and up to 1989, the period we met. You do many other things afterwards, including when we go off to China together on a very Hella-inspired mission in which we all seem to rattle around discovering China in the interior in the 2000s. But I would love to have some questions, and I think some of these areas of the world might come up in questions. So I'm going to suggest we talk for another 10 minutes and then open it up to the floor. It would be such a shame not to hear from people who either know you or are just fascinated by the book. So when do you go back to Europe, and what is the state of the Europe that you go back to? What's happening also in your old German-speaking world, which of course unites us in interest?
Well, I mean, I came back amongst other things, of course, to 1968, which was the French Revolution, which was the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. I reported on both of those, and those were fascinating events which were really quite unforgettable in every way. First, France in '68, going to the Sorbonne, listening to the students, and also later peeling off the walls of Paris some of their revolutionary posters, which I still have hanging in my home today, and then going to Eastern Europe, going to, I never got back in, I was too late to get into Prague, but then was sent off to Romania, where it's assumed the Russians, who were the Soviet Union, would also invade. A whole group of journalists from all over the world were sitting there waiting for the Soviets to rain in from the skies and everywhere. And of course, it didn't happen. Then I was actually posted working out of Geneva, of all places, and was covering out of Geneva, but also again traveling around Europe, a lot of the sort of early British efforts to get into the European economic community. It was a time when Britain wanted to be in, not out. And that was, when I look back on what I was writing then about all the negotiations to join the European Union, still the European community, it seems bizarre when I consider Brexit today. A complete reversal of the situation.
Indeed, yes, but much water under the bridge since then, one can say, on both sides. Can we go back, if you wouldn't mind, Monica, because that's that picture of Ceausescu, which is obviously, I'm fascinated by it. You know me, I just love it. I can't resist an old dictator. There you are. As you say, brilliantly described caption, Romanian self-distancing, self-distancing, an interview with President Ceausescu. Now, President Ceausescu, as well as being a rather repressive tyrant, was not known for giving the most sort of fluent of interviews. How did you get along with him? And tell us a little bit about this encounter.
Well, this is one of my very memorable experiences. He had been invited, believe it or not, on a state visit to Britain because the British government was trying to get him to sign a contract to sell British aircraft to Romania, and Ceausescu, being a wily character, refused to sign that contract unless he was invited on the state. That was the sort of the temptation.
That was in about 78, I think, was 1978?
That's right. And before he just before this state visit was to take place, the Romanians tried to find a British journalist who would come to Romania to interview him, but meant to publish exactly what he told him.
How did that go?
And the Guardian unfortunately accepted this invitation. So off I went. I've been there before. Anyway, I was met at the airport by the chief of protocol and ceremoniously conducted to the hotel, and then told that I would have to work out with a committee of party members the precise questions that we asked. And it was a true negotiation. I learned about negotiating with the communists, with Romania. And when they finally decided that we'd got an agreed set of questions, I was instructed to, as you can see, wear long sleeves. It was summer, and they didn't tell me to wear a hat, and they didn't tell me to wear gloves, which was already a sort of great concession. And then I was taken into the presence, and I was told that I could converse with him for 5 minutes in French, and then we would sit down and do this interview. And there we sat, and then there was no interpreter. And I was told I would get a translation later. And so I was supposed to ask my question. Then he had a sheaf of paper and would answer. And after this had gone on for about 5 minutes, I decided I would keep to the script. And I inserted a question, as it happened, about Willy Brandt, because he was also a visitor at the same time. And he had an interpreter to interpret my English, but he wasn't interpreted back. Nothing was interpreted back to me. And the interpreter was obviously flummoxed, because that was not what was supposed to happen.
It was off script.
So, I have no idea. It was a complete, I was asking questions, he sweating in Romanian. Anyway, and about 3 days later, I got a so-called transcript, which was totally unpublishable. And the Guardian never published. I think that there were just a few lines of something that I made up. But it was and then the only sort of bonus was that I got invited when he came to London. I got invited to a lunch at number 10. So that was the only plus of the whole experience.
There are those interviews, aren't there, where you just think there's got to be a plus down the line from this, but I don't know when it's coming. But you're absolutely right. They're often the ones that do pay out over time. They just didn't really quite seem.
He was a terrible man.
He was also a terrible man. Yes, yes, he was also a terrible man. I think that's right. And met a fittingly terrible end. I'm going to throw open the questions now, because I know we're a long way from 1989 and the fall of communism, which you also covered in depth and where we first met. And also, as I say, you basically gave yourself a completely new lease of life afterwards. And through your great friendship with George Weidenfeld, who we really should, I think, doff our cap to tonight. And here's looking at you, George. You got involved with the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. You were very involved in their outreach to China, and a very useful group looking at Chinese media and being able to arrange exchanges. Actually, what looks like a heady period now in relations with China, no longer so possible. But I do have a feeling that some of these things might come up, and I would just love to open the floor, Hella, if you're happy for that. Monica is our very able curator.
Let's see what comes.
We'll see what comes. It's a rough crowd. What can I tell you? I mean, but there's also a lot of expertise.
I'll take the body blows.
Exactly. There's a lot of love and friendship and expertise in the crowd out there tonight.
They are being suspiciously silent at the moment. I should have been egging people on, but please now use the opportunity to type questions, or indeed, if you'd like to talk, if that feels a better way to do things, then please unmute yourselves and simply start talking.
Very happy to open the floor, and please don't worry about sequence. We can easily make questions work. Who have we got now?
as I say, they're being very suspiciously reticent. I wonder if I could ask a question, Hella. I suspect you've been asked before and you may groan at having to answer it again. But were you ever in your wonderful, long, rich career tempted to go into politics yourself?
No.
No, I had a feeling that was
It's a very short answer.
yeah.
No,
And,
I don't think I mean, I love talking about politics. I love meeting politicians, everything to do with politics, but I never really had any ambitions for myself. I'm not an organizations person, amongst other things. I think, you know, you can't go into politics if you're not also active in a political party. It's perfectly obvious. And it's not my scene. But, you know, I love being an outsider insider. I mean, I think, or rather an insider outsider in both directions.
So, which politicians did you meet, either interview or report on, that you ended up admiring particularly in all those years?
Well, in this country, in Britain.
Abroad? No, I think why limit yourself? You know, anywhere that you covered.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm going to stick to Britain just for a second on this, because inevitably, because if you're covering foreign affairs, you get to know foreign secretaries, and I came to appreciate Geoffrey Howe a great deal. I went on several trips with him, and usually also his wife, and it was, you know, a small group of journalists who covered in those days. Foreign policy was sufficiently important that foreign secretaries used to take a few journalists with them on their sort of major foreign trips, and I did quite a number of them with Geoffrey Howe. And I really learned, I think he was often underrated, and he was a good, warm-hearted person apart from anything else, but I think he was also a very good foreign minister. So that's one person that I would single out. Outside, abroad, well, you know, I often talk of Willy Brandt, because I think
I was hoping you'd mention Willy Brandt.
It's curious, because The Guardian is about to celebrate its 200th anniversary, and I met Willy Brandt on the day that The Guardian was celebrating its 150th anniversary. Guardian had a very big dinner in London to celebrate, and but it also happened to be some interesting problems about Germany and Britain at the time. And I was asked to, if at all possible, to capture Willy Brandt after the official speeches and everything, and get him put a few questions to him on the issues that were in play. And I managed to get hold of him in the crowd after the dinner, and he said to me, "This is no place to talk. Please come back to my hotel afterwards." And of course, you know, was I going back to the hotel? Yes, I did. And went to his suite, and we sat then on the window ledge and talked deep into the early morning, not about policy, but about Germany, about the Holocaust, about coming to terms with the perpetrators of Holocaust and all that went with it. And this, that conversation and his example and his philosophy really helped me to come to terms with Germany, which until then I had not done properly. And out of that conversation developed really a friendship that continued until he died, and we always stayed in touch from time to time. whenever I was in Berlin or in Bonn at that time, I always met with him. And it was an important relationship to me, and he made a lot of difference to my thinking. And really,
Interesting. Yeah.
Since then, Germany, I've come to admire and enjoy it, and have many friends in Germany, and really transformed my whole attitude towards Germany.
May I ask a question?
Please, come on.
Hella, Richard Calver-Caresi, we have
Hello.
met.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about your coming to terms with Austria, your homeland, in that brilliant book, Guilty Victim? How difficult did you find that?
I didn't find it very difficult. It was much easier for me to come to terms with Austria than with Germany. It may sound peculiar, but I was lucky in one respect, at least I consider it lucky, that my mother, unlike many of the other refugees, never had that feeling of never again, I can never go back to Austria, everybody is anti-Semitic, and it will never reform itself. On the contrary, she encouraged me to go back to Austria quite soon after, very soon after, again, after I got nationality, and went back partly because she wanted to find out if any of her belongings could somehow be retrieved. She didn't, for various reasons, didn't want to go herself, but she was happy for me to go. And from that time onwards, I spent a lot of holidays in Austria. I regarded myself initially more as a tourist than to have any sense of belonging. But eventually, when I started, Austria eventually became part of my East Central European parish when I was the Guardian's East European correspondent. So I started going to Austria to report about its politics and so on. And I just became acclimatized to it. And I feel as happy and as relaxed in Austria as anywhere else. And I go back to Austria happily. And it was much, much easier for me to have that transformation that it was with respect to Germany.
Interesting. Yeah. You go back to Austria quite a lot now, don't you? I think one year when this was all still possible, you had more of an active summer in Austria. That you did more things in the summer. Yes. One summer in Austria than I'd done in all year. I thought the next time we get in touch, you'll be skiing. You like your
I even managed to have a month in Austria last summer.
Yeah, Hella is the only person I know who managed to make us very jealous by somehow managing to, not only, we should say, an extraordinary achievement this is to fit in a book at this stage of career, also get it together during the lockdown and go on a month's holiday in Austria. We have a superwoman. Anyone else just like to chip in a thought as in our last
I cannot believe there aren't any questions, and I think there was one person, Caroline Slifkin, wanting to ask the question herself. Caroline, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Hella, thanks for that. I know there's not much time, but can you say a little bit more about your experience of coming Kindertransport, young child, and what we're seeing with refugees today, and different amendments that people are trying? What can we do, as you say, to try and learn educationally from your experience? Sorry, it's a bit of a hard question at the end.
Yes, I think that is a very hard question. I think having been a refugee, one has to be on the side of today's refugees. I get very, very angry when I see what is happening here now. For instance, Priti Patel with this extraordinary concept of saying people claiming refugee status have to be sent off to some remote island while their future is decided. And I think this country was so generous in taking in refugees in the 1930s. And in our age, I think the former refugees like me, I think it's their absolute duty to try and promote understanding for what it is to be a refugee, and not to turn people away, but to try and help them to come in, to be able to acclimatize and to have some kind of existence in this country. So I get very angry when I find that ex-refugees or people like myself who now in turn turn against refugees coming into the country and want to limit it. I think that is utterly wrong.
Is it, one question
Sorry,
I've
does that answer your question at all? What?
I'm sure
sorry,
it does. I think there's somebody called Kate, am I right?
Yes, Kate Hayes.
Please do. Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Okay.
Hello, Hella. I just wanted to ask whether you were aware in the course of your rather extraordinary career that you were in fact a groundbreaker as well as a career, as a pioneer, as a woman, and whether there was ever an occasion where, because you were a woman, you were not actually able to do an interview that you wanted to do.
Of course. I think that must have happened many times.
Really, because you were a woman, not because of
Oh,
anything.
I see. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, just because.
Yes, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't paying proper attention. No, you are really asking me to what extent have I experienced discrimination as a woman. I think, on the whole, either it's been luck or to some extent could be my personality, but I'm not conscious of having really suffered seriously from discrimination. Of course, I can cite examples where I feel where I've been pushed aside, this hasn't happened or that hasn't happened, but I think also there have been many pluses, and I think one of the pluses were that because there were so few women around doing journalism, that people remembered you more easily because you stood out from the crowd. And quite certain that that helped me enormously during my, my beginnings as a journalist, just simply because I was a woman and people would remember me as a woman, even if they didn't remember me as a journalist or what I was doing. And it certainly helped me to get access to people that I might not otherwise have found. But of course, later that changed, because now, first of all, fortunately, there are far more women in journalism, so no longer stand out just because you're a woman. I mean, now it has to be what you can do and what you achieve yourself. But I think in many ways, I was fortunate enough to do a great chunk of my work as a journalist during a period when discrimination works in both directions, both positively and negatively.
Great question, Kate. Thank you. Mark King sent me a question, and it's a good one because it brings us a bit up to date, and certainly in the last few years of your activity was with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and its work. It was obviously set up by George Weidenfeld, a great friend of yours and someone you often made common cause with. Tell us a little bit about what you wanted to achieve with strategic dialogue, a very George sort of phrase, I think, which always meant at the light-hearted end of it was just bringing people together and fantastic groups of influential and interesting people to talk, which was also one of George's favorite things, let's face it. But it also had a deeper purpose, and it's continued to do so. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, what it does now is far removed from what it started off as and what I was doing. Today it's involved only principally with counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization. The way it was founded, the idea was less strategic dialogue, but bridge building. That was the thinking behind the institute that was set up because George Weinberg simply, his belief was that we had to build bridges between cultures, between countries, between people, and to create a more understanding international community. And that's what strategic dialogue is. At the time, I think when the title was invented, not that much thought was given to the meaning of strategic in that context, because it was the bridge, the cultural bridge that we were concerned with, and the political bridge, and so on and so forth. And it started off really as a concept. George always had something called the Club of Three, which brought together leading figures from Britain, France, and Germany. And the Institute was an expansion of that concept. And it had a very small staff, and I was brought in to do various projects, conferences. We did a whole series of conferences on any number of subjects, strategic, economic, and above all the arts. And it was the arts that brought me to China, because we had an arts conference in Beijing. And that was the beginning of other projects in China. And as Anne said, it was a fascinating time, because that was a period when China seemed to be opening to some extent. And we had real conversations with
We did, didn't
Chinese.
we? Yeah, we did. And that's such a shame. And we were able to talk to young Chinese about their use of social media and things that would now be very, very dangerous for them as well. We did have to sit through some quite long Chinese opera about courtesans. Do you remember?
Yes.
Just Hella and I sat there thinking, is it that time already? How many more courtesans can we get through tonight? Listen, thank you so much for this evening. Before I hand back to Monica to bring down the curtain, I just want to say what fantastic insight it has been into the work of an extraordinary journalist who I think is still, she's still writing. She's not going to stop. We can't stop Hella Pick writing. It's what she does. And what she also does is she does it with great insight and great, I think, affection for her trade. She's great. She's very shrewd, great understanding. She also has great affection and warmth for the business of being a journalist, and that interest that you need to keep even when the world has been very trying. And we've touched on some of the subjects there recently and earlier about how wrong things can go. She keeps her interest and that divine spark that you need to cover it with Elan alive. And that's why Hella Pick is a great journalist. And that's why Invisible Walls is a great book. But you knew that already. And if you didn't, I hope that you get hold of a copy, and even better, buy a copy, and then you'll find out. And Hella, thank you so much for sharing time with us.
And thank you. It's been a real
Wonderful
privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Lovely. And many thanks to you too, because the kind of warmth and the sort of informality of the way you engage with Hella was also one of the delights of this evening. So thanks to you both very much indeed.
Thanks so much.
I think we probably there was another question on the question of a comment or no question about anti-Semitism and the role that it's played in your life, Hella. I don't know whether you would like to conclude by saying something about that, or whether you feel enough is enough, as they say. The night is drawing on. Up to you. It's your prerogative.
Well, you want me to start and go on a long lecture?
Yes, I fear so. Shall I read you exactly what somebody called Jonathan said? You've been a refugee. You've experienced anti-Semitism. How do you see the rise of anti-Semitism these days?
Well, first of all, of course, I'm deeply concerned about growing anti-Semitism, which is visible in so many different countries and places. So, but that at least gives me an opportunity to say that one of the things where I'm now trying to do some work is something, the Sussex University Beinfeld Institute of Jewish Studies, which was set up precisely with the aim of identifying and fighting anti-Semitism, and is an enterprise that Sussex University has embraced with considerable vigor, and which is supported by Germany, which has named a professorship and funding a professorship for this institute, and also the Austrian government, which is also financially supporting the institute and is collaborating on a number of projects. So, and I'm very much involved now in fundraising for this, because that is obviously, if we're going to have any kind of effective impact on anti-Semitism, the institute needs to be funded much better than it is in person. So I'm sorry to end up with this appeal. Anyone who's interested, I'm happy to explain it to them.
Very good. Well, that's an appropriate note, I think, on which to end. Not the fundraising, but the, activity in the institute itself. Very good. Well, listen, I think that is probably time to draw things to a close. Once again, many, many thanks. Thanks to the audience as well. And just to repeat that the event has, let me just go to gallery view so we can see each other somewhat better. The event has been recorded, as all the Insiders Outsiders related ones generally are, and it will be uploaded, thanks to my very wonderful IT assistant, Rachel Adams, within a few days, possibly even tomorrow, if she gets onto it quickly, onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. Very easy to find on Google. Get in touch if you can't find it, but it will add a very valuable element to what's already a fine array of rich topics, you know, in this fantastically rich cultural terrain. So thank you very much. I wish you all good night and all the very best. And hope to
Good
see
night,
you
everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
Good night,
oh,
Hella.
Good night.
So thank you so much.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Hella. Wonderful.
Mhm.